Did you know one man's genius saved an entire mission after everyone had written him off? How did he do it? Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, hit that like button if you're intrigued, share with friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Just moments before the most important mission of his career, Captain Nathan Reed stood frozen, staring at the flashing diagnostic lights of the engine control room. The LM-2500 engine, a critical component of the Navy's newest destroyer, was failing, right when it mattered most. The crew worked frantically, but nothing they tried seemed to fix the issue. Engineers scrambled over their stations, inputting commands and rerouting power, but the engine refused to cooperate. The countdown to departure was ticking away, and the mission was slipping from their grasp. A solution felt just out of reach, and as the tension in the air thickened, Captain Reed knew that the stakes couldn't have been higher. The mission to intercept a rogue fleet threatening U.S. waters had to proceed, or the repercussions would be catastrophic. Desperation grew as the hours passed, and finally, there was no more time to waste. Captain Reed made the fateful decision to call in an expert. Someone whose reputation as an engine specialist was legendary, but whose name had long since faded from the Navy's current ranks. The Admiral in charge, Admiral Samuel Foster, was hesitant but knew this was no time for pride. The clock was ticking, and this was a critical juncture. "He's the only one who can fix this," Admiral Foster muttered under his breath, dialing the number he had not used in years. The call was made, and within moments, the legendary engineer, Elias Graham, would be summoned from his retirement. For many, the name Elias Graham brought a mix of awe and regret. He was the man who had built the engine systems for the destroyer fleet, systems that were now the backbone of the Navy's combat force. Yet, despite his monumental contributions, Graham had fallen from grace years ago. An engine failure on a mission gone wrong had ended his career, and the Navy had forced him into retirement without hearing his side of the story. It had been a fall from the pinnacle of military engineering to the shadows of obscurity. Yet, now, as the mission loomed, it seemed there was no one else who could save the day. Admiral Foster's decision was driven by both necessity and guilt. He knew that Graham had been unjustly blamed for the failure all those years ago, but that was in the past. This was about the mission. This was about saving countless lives and securing national security. It was time for Graham to return, whether he was ready or not. As the call went through, Graham's phone buzzed, and he answered, hearing the familiar voice of Admiral Foster. For a moment, he was silent. The years of bitterness and abandonment rushed back, but there was no turning away. His duty, even after all these years, called him back. With a heavy sigh, he agreed. "I'll help," he said simply, knowing the complexity of the task ahead. He would do what no one else could, not for the Navy, not for the Admiral, but for the mission itself. The stage was set, and with just 72 hours to go, Graham was about to face the very thing that had once destroyed his career, an engine failure. This time, however, the stakes were much higher. Elias Graham had always been a man of machines, long before the Navy had recognized his genius. From a young age, he had been fascinated by anything with moving parts. While other children played outside or ran errands, Elias would sit for hours, dismantling old engines, motors, and anything mechanical, eager to understand how they worked. He wasn't just curious, he was obsessed. He had an innate ability to fix things, to make them run like new, and that obsession eventually shaped his destiny. His family, of course, didn't understand. His father, a humble electrician, saw no future in a boy who wanted to spend his days pulling apart car engines instead of studying for college. But Elias's mother, though equally skeptical, could see the spark in her son's eyes. She encouraged him, sometimes reluctantly, to follow his heart. And follow it, he did. By the time Elias reached high school, he had already learned more than most mechanics did in a lifetime. He worked part-time at a local garage, fixing cars, boats, and even the occasional tractor. The satisfaction he felt when a broken machine roared to life again was intoxicating. But deep down, Elias knew he was capable of more. The Navy was looking for engineers, and the thought of working on the most advanced machines in the world was irresistible. He enlisted at the age of 18, after high school graduation, driven by a desire to test his abilities and work on the cutting-edge technology of the military. He didn't have a fancy degree or a pedigree, but he had something more, an unparalleled understanding of machinery and an unrelenting drive to be the best. The Navy saw potential in him right away and quickly fast-tracked him through the ranks. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Elias was already a senior machinery officer. It wasn't long before his skills in engineering caught the eye of some of the top brass in the Navy. They had a new project in mind, a next-generation destroyer fleet that would change the face of naval warfare. It was ambitious, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The engines would need to be faster, more powerful, and more reliable than anything before. And that's where Elias Graham came in. The task was daunting. Designing and developing engines that could withstand the extreme pressures of modern naval combat while maintaining a high level of efficiency. The LM-2500 engine, as it came to be known, was Elias's brainchild. He worked day and night alongside a dedicated team, poring over every detail of the engine's design, ensuring that it would be the most reliable and powerful engine ever built for a destroyer. After countless tests, revisions, and sleepless nights, the LM-2500 was born, and it became the heartbeat of the Navy's new Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. For a time, Elias was a hero. The Navy was thrilled with his work, and his reputation soared. The LM-2500 engine became the gold standard, and Elias was celebrated as one of the foremost authorities on naval propulsion systems. But fame came at a cost. The pressure to maintain perfection was immense, and every failure, no matter how small, was scrutinized. Elias had always been used to perfection, but he could feel the weight of expectations growing heavier with each passing day. Elias's career hit a dramatic turning point during a routine mission. It was supposed to be a simple operation, a mid-range deployment of the destroyer USS Vanguard, carrying out a series of exercises off the coast of California. But something went terribly wrong. The Vanguard's engine, powered by Elias's LM-2500 system, failed mid-operation. The crew was stranded, adrift, in hostile waters for several hours before they could be rescued. Despite the immediate investigation into the incident, Elias's reputation would never recover. The failure of the LM-2500 engine was a devastating blow, not just to the Navy's confidence in the system but to Elias's standing in the military. Despite being one of the leading experts in the field, he was blamed for the malfunction. It didn't matter that the failure was a result of a minor manufacturing flaw that wasn't linked to any of Elias's designs, it didn't matter that the fault had been out of his hands. The Navy had already made up its mind. In their eyes, he was responsible. Without so much as a hearing, Elias was pushed into early retirement. The Navy stripped him of his titles and dismissed him from service. It was a humiliating fall from grace, and as he left the Navy in disgrace, Elias felt betrayed. He had devoted his life to his work, and yet, in the blink of an eye, it had all been taken from him. There were no celebrations, no retirements with honors, just an abrupt end to a career that had been nothing short of extraordinary. In the years that followed, Elias struggled to regain his footing. He withdrew from public life, seeking solace in his small workshop at home, far from the Navy's prying eyes. He spent his days working on personal projects, keeping his skills sharp but out of the limelight. People who had once revered him now viewed him with suspicion or pity. Even those who knew the truth about the engine failure didn't dare speak up. The system had made its decision, and there was no reversing it. Then came the call. It had been years since anyone in the Navy had reached out to Elias. His name had faded from the list of experts called upon in times of crisis. But now, with a mission on the line, a new generation of officers had recognized the undeniable truth: there was no one else who could fix this. The problem was unique, and only Elias Graham's deep knowledge of the LM-2500 system could solve it. They were desperate, and the clock was ticking. Elias listened to Admiral Foster's voice on the other end of the line, asking for his help. The mission was critical, there was no time to waste. At first, Elias hesitated. The memories of his fall from grace were still fresh, and the bitterness lingered in his heart. But the weight of the mission, the lives at stake, was too great to ignore. With a sigh, Elias agreed to help, knowing that the past couldn't be undone, but the future still held promise. He had a chance to redeem himself, not just in the eyes of the Navy, but in his own. This was his moment to prove that the genius that had once been celebrated was still very much alive. As he prepared to leave his home and head back to the Navy, Elias didn't know what to expect. He didn't know if the engineers would accept him, if the crew would trust him, or if his expertise would be enough to save the mission. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to back down. The clock was ticking. And Elias Graham was ready to make his return. Elias Graham's old heart raced as he stood at the entrance of the maintenance hangar. The familiar sounds of power tools, humming machines, and clattering metal flooded his senses, yet the setting felt strangely foreign. This wasn't the clean, well-organized workshop he had grown used to in his retirement. The floors here were stained with oil, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of exhaust and grease. It had been years since he had stepped into a Navy repair bay, and yet, the sight of engineers working in a frenzy brought back memories of late-night shifts, trying to figure out what went wrong when everything seemed right. Captain Nathan Reed's team had already begun their work, but the tension in the air was palpable. There was no time to waste. In less than 3 days, the destroyer, USS Vanguard, was set to embark on a critical mission. The engine that powered the ship, the LM-2500, had malfunctioned, and so far, nothing had worked to fix it. The Navy's finest engineers had tried every trick they knew, but the engine refused to cooperate. This wasn't just any engine failure, it was a catastrophic one, and no one seemed to know why. Elias stepped inside, his boots clicking on the hard concrete floor. As he walked past the rows of engineers, they paused for a moment, acknowledging him with hesitant nods. It was clear from their expressions that his presence here wasn't welcomed with open arms. They were proud of their work, of their expertise, and they resented the idea that someone from the past, someone who hadn't worked on the systems in years, was now here to fix it. But Elias didn't care. This wasn't about pride. This was about saving lives. And if he had to prove himself again to a new generation of engineers, so be it. Captain Reed approached him, his face lined with stress but tinged with relief. "Glad you could make it, Mr. Graham," he said, offering his hand. "We've been stuck here for hours, trying to figure out what's wrong with this engine. I hope you have better luck than we've had." Elias shook his hand, giving a curt nod. "I'll take a look. Show me where the problem is." He didn't waste time with pleasantries, there was no room for that now. The engine bay was a mess of wires, pipes, and diagnostic screens. Engineers crowded around the enormous LM-2500 unit, some flipping through maintenance manuals, others tapping away at keyboards, trying to isolate the issue. The screens flickered with error codes, most of them pointing to vague issues with the rotor assembly, but no one had been able to figure out what was causing the engine to vibrate violently when powered up. Elias stood silently for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Time was not on their side. The mission was just 72 hours away, and if they didn't get this engine running, the entire operation would be a failure. The Navy had already invested so much in this mission, it couldn't afford another catastrophe. "I'll need a few minutes to inspect the engine myself," Elias said, stepping forward. Captain Reed gave a quick nod. "Of course. We'll step back, let you do your thing." Elias approached the engine with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who had spent a lifetime with these machines. His hands moved with practiced precision as he unscrewed access panels and peered inside the intricate systems of the LM-2500. As he crouched beside the engine, he heard the telltale hum of power flowing through the system. He placed a brass rod against the engine housing, listening closely. The vibrations were faint at first, but they were unmistakable. There was something off, something wrong that wasn't showing up on the diagnostic screens. He closed his eyes for a moment, tuning out the noise around him. The sound of the engine was like a symphony to him, each vibration, each hum telling a story. He followed the vibrations down to the rotor assembly. That's when he knew. The misalignment was subtle, but it was there. The rotor blades were slightly off-center, causing a cascading effect of vibrations throughout the engine. "This is it," he said, standing up and turning to the engineers who were watching intently. "The rotor assembly is misaligned. That's the source of the vibrations." The engineers exchanged glances, and Elias could see the skepticism in their eyes. They had run every test they could think of and had come up with nothing. They didn't want to believe that something so simple could be the cause of the issue. "You're sure?" one of the engineers asked, still doubting. "I've been working with this system for decades," Elias said, his voice steady and sure. "This engine doesn't just fail for no reason. Misalignment of the rotor blades is causing vibrations, and those vibrations are throwing off the entire system. I can hear it." It was a bold claim, but Elias's confidence left little room for argument. Captain Reed, standing off to the side, stepped forward. "All right. What do we need to do to fix it?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with the urgency of the situation. Elias turned and pointed to a nearby workbench. "Get me the alignment tools. We're going to need to recalibrate the rotor blades. It won't be easy, but it's the only way." The engineers sprang into action, gathering the necessary tools and preparing to realign the engine. Elias, despite his years away from active duty, had not lost his touch. He directed the team with a precision that left no room for error. The tension in the air lifted slightly as the engineers worked in unison, following his lead. For the first time since he had arrived, Elias felt a flicker of hope. This was no longer a mission doomed to fail. There was a way forward. As the team worked together, Elias's mind raced with memories of his past. Of his earlier days in the Navy, when his word was trusted without question, when he was revered as one of the best in the field. He thought back to the day the engine failure had derailed his career, the day the Navy had cast him aside. They hadn't given him a chance to explain himself, to defend his work. That was in the past now, though. He was here for something bigger than personal grudges. He was here to fix what had broken, to save a mission that mattered. Finally, after hours of careful adjustments, the rotor was realigned. The engineers double-checked everything, running diagnostic tests to confirm the fix. One by one, the error codes disappeared from the screens. The engine hummed to life. The vibrations that had once threatened to tear it apart were gone. The LM-2500 was back online. Captain Reed stood silently, watching the entire process unfold. He had doubted Elias at first, but now he saw it for himself. Elias Graham was the expert. The man had just saved this mission. The destroyer, USS Vanguard, was ready to sail again. Elias wiped his brow, exhausted but satisfied. He didn't need praise, didn't need accolades. All that mattered was that the mission would proceed. The engine was fixed, and the crew had their chance to succeed. As the USS Vanguard sat at the edge of the maintenance bay, ready to embark on its mission, Elias Graham stood in the background, his hands folded behind his back. The sound of the engine humming in perfect synchronization was a sweet, familiar music to his ears, but it was also a reminder of the years he had spent in the shadows, far removed from this kind of victory. He had been cast out, forgotten, pushed aside, but not anymore. The moment the rotor realignment had been completed, the tension in the hangar had dissipated. For the first time in days, engineers and crew members allowed themselves to breathe. The engine had passed its power tests, and the diagnostics confirmed it was running at optimal efficiency. There had been no more vibrations, no more signs of malfunction. The LM-2500 was fixed. The mission was back on track. But as Elias watched the Navy personnel around him prepare for the mission, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his own history pressing against him. The whispers of those who had once doubted him still echoed in his mind. The cold dismissal, the ruined reputation. It had all come flooding back when Admiral Foster had called him out of retirement. But none of that mattered now. The Vanguard was going to sail, and Elias had played a pivotal role in making it happen. Captain Nathan Reed approached Elias, offering a rare smile, a silent acknowledgement of his contribution. "It's a good thing you were here, Mr. Graham," Reed said, his voice calm but sincere. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Elias gave him a curt nod. "It was nothing," he said, the humility in his voice as genuine as it was unspoken. He had worked with countless engines throughout his career, and while the task was significant, it wasn't the most difficult problem he had ever solved. Still, to hear Reed's gratitude was a reminder that his skills hadn't faded with age. As the ship's crew finished their preparations, Admiral Foster appeared, walking toward Elias with purpose. The moment their eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding between them. The past, everything that had happened before, was still there, lingering in the air, but there was a job to do. It wasn't about history. It was about the future. "Elias," the Admiral began, his voice gruff but with a tone that suggested genuine respect, "you've done something extraordinary here. You've saved this mission. The Navy owes you more than just gratitude." Elias raised an eyebrow, surprised by the Admiral's acknowledgement. For years, he had been nothing more than a forgotten name in the Navy's history. And now, here was the man who had once overseen his forced retirement, standing before him, offering not only his gratitude but something more, redemption. "I did what was needed," Elias replied, his voice steady. "This wasn't about me. It was about getting the job done. The mission is important. That's all that matters." Foster paused, his eyes narrowing as if considering the weight of Elias's words. The Admiral had always believed in results, not words, but now he saw something in Elias that had long been absent from his perception. The man standing before him wasn't the same person who had been blamed for an engine failure all those years ago. This was someone who had overcome his past, someone who had proven his worth when it counted most. "You're right," Foster said finally. "But that doesn't mean we can't make things right. Your career, what happened to you, that was wrong. The Navy owes you more than just this mission. It owes you your reputation back." Elias's eyes softened, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. He had never expected this moment to come. When he had been cast aside, he had accepted it. The world had moved on, and so had he. But now, in front of him, was the man who had the power to restore what had been taken from him. It was a moment he had never allowed himself to hope for. Yet here it was. "Sir, Elias began, but the Admiral cut him off. "No, let me say it." Foster's voice was firm, but there was a warmth to it now, something he hadn't shown Elias in years. "You were the best we had, Graham. We were wrong to push you out without so much as a fair hearing. I can't change what happened, but I can do what's right from here on out." Elias nodded, his throat tight. There was nothing more to say. The Admiral had offered him what he never thought he would get, a chance at redemption. "We'll be compensating you for your time here," Foster continued, "and I'm personally going to make sure your name is cleared. The Navy is going to publicly acknowledge your role in the development of the LM-2500, and will be honoring your contributions to the fleet. Consider this a formal apology. You've earned it." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and Elias allowed them to sink in. It was more than he had ever expected, more than he had ever thought he deserved. But he would take it. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of injustice begin to fade. It wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about a recognition of his years of hard work and dedication, the things that had been overshadowed by a single failure. The Admiral extended his hand, and Elias took it, shaking it firmly. "Thank you," Elias said, his voice thick with gratitude and something else. Something close to closure. It wasn't the kind of victory he had imagined when he first joined the Navy, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the Admiral walked away to attend to other matters, Elias remained standing at the edge of the hangar. He watched as the crew of the Vanguard prepared the ship for departure. The hum of the engine, now fully restored, echoed through the bay like a song of triumph. In the distance, Captain Reed turned back toward Elias, offering a salute. Elias returned the gesture, his expression calm, but inside, something had shifted. It wasn't just the engine that had been fixed, it was his sense of purpose, his belief in his own worth. The past, with all its mistakes and betrayals, was finally behind him. And as the Vanguard sailed out to sea, with its engines roaring in perfect harmony, Elias Graham felt for the first time in a long while that the world was right. He had been given another chance, not just to redeem himself, but to reclaim the place he had once held among the Navy's finest. He had found redemption not in the eyes of others, but in his own heart. The USS Vanguard was now at sea, its engines humming steadily beneath the deck. The destroyer had set sail for its mission, one that had been nearly thwarted by the catastrophic engine failure. But thanks to Elias Graham's expertise, the crew was now on course, heading into international waters, ready to confront the rogue fleet threatening the nation's security. The air on board the ship had shifted in the wake of the crisis. Tension had dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of confidence. The crew knew they owed their success to Elias. The engineers who had once doubted him now saw him as a savior, a quiet hero who had come from retirement to fix a problem they could not solve. They worked in earnest, confident in the fact that their ship was in capable hands. Still, Elias remained a quiet figure, standing on the fringes, watching the crew go about their duties. He didn't seek recognition. He had never been one for accolades. His satisfaction came from knowing the job had been done, and done right. The engine was humming smoothly, the destroyer was sailing, and the mission was back on track. But in the silence of his own mind, Elias knew that the completion of the mission was just the beginning. This was his moment not only to prove his skill but to right the wrongs that had defined his career. Captain Nathan Reed often found himself watching Elias from a distance. There was an air of mystery about the man, a quiet resilience that Reed admired but couldn't fully understand. He knew that Elias was more than just a mechanic. He was a man who had given everything to the Navy, only to have it ripped away by circumstances beyond his control. Yet, now that he was here, back on board, Reed could see the man's true worth. Elias was more than an expert, he was a symbol of redemption, someone who had been cast out and then, when given the chance, had risen to save them all. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Captain Reed sought Elias out on the deck. The sea stretched endlessly before them, a vast, unbroken expanse of water. The sky, tinged with shades of orange and pink, seemed to echo the quiet contemplation in Reed's own mind. "Mr. Graham," Captain Reed began, his voice carrying on the cool evening breeze. "You've done something none of us thought possible. We were all ready to write this mission off as a failure. But you didn't. You didn't give up on us." Elias turned his head slightly, acknowledging the captain's words. "The mission was never meant to fail," he said quietly. "It was just a matter of finding the right solution. The engine was never the problem. It was just misaligned, and once I saw that, I knew what had to be done." Reed smiled, though his expression was tinged with respect. "You've shown us all what true leadership is. Not by command, but by action. By doing what's necessary, no matter the cost. I wish we had more men like you on this ship." Elias's eyes drifted back to the horizon, the weight of the captain's words sinking in. "Leadership," he said after a pause, "isn't about command. It's about knowing what needs to be done and doing it, even when no one's watching. I spent years learning that lesson, not through promotion, but through failure. I've had my share of missteps, and I've learned that the hardest part is not giving up when you're told you failed. Captain Reed nodded thoughtfully, his gaze following Elias's. It's clear now that we couldn't have done this without you. Not just for your skills, but for your heart. You cared about the outcome. That's what made all the difference. A silence fell between them, and for a moment, both men were lost in their thoughts. Elias had heard these kinds of words before, but there was something different in Reed's voice. It wasn't just gratitude, it was an acknowledgement of something deeper. Elias had rebuilt more than just the LM-2500 engine. He had repaired the trust between the Navy and himself. He had proven that no matter how far he had fallen, he was still the man they needed. The rest of the journey continued without incident. The crew worked seamlessly, knowing that they had overcome the greatest challenge they would face on this mission. The engineers, under Elias's subtle guidance, made adjustments to other parts of the ship's systems, ensuring that everything would remain in optimal condition for the duration of their operation. The mission was on track, and success was now within their grasp. But as the ship sailed on, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. The job had been done. The engine was running, the ship was sailing, and the mission was progressing. But there was one thing left to do. Finally clear his name. The formal apology 2 days into the mission, Admiral Samuel Foster called Elias into his private quarters. The Admiral had been a quiet presence on board, overseeing the operation from a distance. But now, as the mission continued smoothly, he was ready to fulfill the promise he had made to Elias. When Elias arrived, the Admiral greeted him with a firm handshake, something that hadn't happened in years. The tension that had once existed between them was now gone, replaced with something new, mutual respect. Elias, the Admiral began, his voice steady, I've just received the final approval from the higher-ups. The Navy has agreed to make things right. He paused, watching Elias closely. It's been a long time coming, but I'll be putting out a formal statement acknowledging your contributions. You'll be officially reinstated as an expert on the LM-2500, and your role in its development will be recognized. Elias's heart skipped a beat, but he remained composed. It's been a long time, he said quietly. I never expected anything like this. But I'm not doing this for the recognition. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. I know, Foster replied, nodding. But you deserve this. You deserve to be recognized for what you did. And for the years the Navy failed to appreciate your work. This is long overdue. Elias felt the weight of the Admiral's words. The years of being forgotten, the sting of injustice, had all led to this moment. It wasn't about the apology, it was about the truth finally being acknowledged. He had given his life to the Navy, and now, for the first time, they were giving something back. The ship's return as the USS Vanguard returned to port, having completed its mission successfully, Elias felt a quiet sense of pride. The crew had performed admirably, and the mission had been completed without incident. They had done their job, and they had done it well. And Elias had been part of that success, part of something greater than himself. When the ship docked, Elias stood near the edge of the pier, watching the crew disembark. Captain Reed approached him one final time. You're leaving? Reed asked, his voice tinged with a hint of regret. Elias nodded. There's nothing more for me here. I've done what I came to do. You'll always have a place with us, Elias. You've earned it. Elias offered a small smile, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Thank you, Captain. But I've got my own path to follow. It's time for me to move on. As Elias turned and walked away, he didn't look back. The past was behind him, and the future was his to shape. He had completed his mission, reclaimed his honor, and in the process, had found a new sense of peace. His work was never about fame or recognition, it had always been about making things right. And now, finally, he had. The warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun bathed the Navy base in a quiet serenity. The USS Vanguard had returned to port, and the mission that had once seemed doomed was now marked as a success. The crew had accomplished their task with precision, and the rogue fleet threatening the nation's shores had been neutralized. The engines hummed perfectly beneath the hull, the machinery that had once failed now restored to its full potential. But for Elias Graham, the satisfaction of the mission's completion was bittersweet. He stood at the far end of the pier, watching the final stages of the ship's return. The air was thick with the smells of saltwater, diesel fuel, and fresh ocean breeze. The sounds of the crew disembarking, laughing, and shaking hands filled the air, but Elias couldn't bring himself to join them. He had done what he came here to do, and now, it was time to leave. The past was finally behind him. For years, he had carried the weight of his forced retirement, the unjust blame that had crushed his spirit. But now, as he reflected on everything that had happened, on the engine he had fixed, the ship that had set sail once again, and the mission that had been a success, he realized that this journey had been about far more than just one man's redemption. It had been about reclaiming his place in a world that had forgotten him, a world that had cast him aside for the smallest of mistakes. The call he had received from Admiral Foster had opened a door he had long since closed. At first, he had hesitated to answer it. After all, what could the Navy offer him now? The bitterness of years past was still fresh in his heart. But when the Admiral had spoken to him, there had been something different in his voice, something that made Elias believe that, perhaps, there was more to this than just another job. The Admiral had promised him an apology, but what he had given Elias was something deeper, an opportunity to finish the unfinished business of his life. Now, as the ship completed its docking and the crew walked away, Elias felt the weight of his decision. The Navy had given him more than just an acknowledgement of his skills. They had restored his reputation, yes, but they had also given him a second chance to feel whole again. He had proved to himself, and to the world, that the mistakes of the past did not define who he was. His skills, his heart, and his dedication to the mission were what mattered in the end. The quiet return as Elias walked away from the dock, he made his way to the small administrative office where Admiral Foster had arranged for him to meet with some of the Navy's top brass. This was the final step in the long road to redemption, officially clearing his name in the public records. The paperwork had already been drawn up, the formal acknowledgement of his contributions to the LM-2500 engine development, and the recognition of his unjust treatment. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. When he entered the office, he was greeted by Admiral Foster, who was standing behind a large oak desk, his face grave but kind. Alongside him stood several other naval officers, their expressions serious. These men had the power to rewrite history, to change the narrative that had once cast Elias as a villain. And now, they were ready to do just that. "Mr. Graham," Admiral Foster said, gesturing for Elias to sit. "We've had a chance to review everything in detail. The Navy owes you more than just an apology. It owes you the recognition you never received. You were right about the LM-2500 from the beginning, and we failed to see that." Elias took a seat, his back straight, though his heart was heavy with emotion. It wasn't just the acknowledgement that mattered now, it was the finality of it all. For the first time in years, he could feel the weight of his past lifting. The sting of the unjust retirement, the years spent in silence, the doubts about his worth, those were all being erased, slowly but surely, by these words. The Admiral continued, his tone solemn but genuine. "As of today, your name will be cleared, and the public record will reflect your true contributions to the Navy. The LM-2500 system, the destroyers you helped design, they'll all have your mark on them, Elias. We've also arranged for a formal ceremony at the Naval Yard. It's a small gesture, but one that reflects our deepest regret for what happened all those years ago." Elias looked at the men in the room, their faces filled with sincerity. For a long moment, he didn't know what to say. Words had never come easily to him, especially when it came to matters of the heart. But he had been fighting for this moment for so long. Now that it was here, he could only nod slowly, unable to find the words to express the gratitude that welled up inside him. "It's enough," he finally said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I never needed the ceremony, never needed the accolades. I just needed to know that I had done my job right. And that the truth was known." Admiral Foster's expression softened, and he extended his hand. "You've done more than that, Elias. You've given us all a lesson in humility, in dedication, and in second chances. For that, we thank you." As Elias shook the Admiral's hand, he felt the last remnants of the bitterness and resentment that had once consumed him begin to melt away. This wasn't just the Navy giving him back his career. It was the Navy giving him something more, the chance to find peace, to know that the work he had devoted his life to was recognized, that his name would stand alongside those of other great engineers and inventors. The legacy of the LM-2500. Back in his small workshop, Elias sat alone at his desk, surrounded by the tools and machinery he had spent his life perfecting. He had returned to this space after leaving the Navy base for the final time, and though the world outside had moved on, he had never truly left his work behind. The hum of the world's engines, the rhythmic pulse of machinery, it was all still a part of him. He thought about the younger engineers who had once doubted him, who had questioned his skills when he walked into the maintenance hangar. They had learned something important that day, something that no textbook could teach. They had learned that true expertise didn't come from degrees or titles, it came from experience, from living through the failures and successes that shaped a person's understanding of their craft. Elias had come full circle. The Navy had given him back his reputation, his respect, and his career. But the most important gift had been the chance to prove to himself that he still had the passion, the skill, and the drive to fix what was broken. Not just engines, but relationships, reputations, and the truth. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Captain Nathan Reed. "We did it, Elias. The mission was a success. Couldn't have done it without you." Elias smiled slightly and tapped a quick reply. "You're welcome, Captain. The Vanguard was always meant to sail." As he set the phone down, he leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The world was moving forward, and so was he. The past was behind him, the future was ahead, and for the first time in years, he felt free. Elias Graham had redeemed himself, not just in the eyes of the Navy, but in his own heart. His legacy was no longer defined by a single mistake. It was defined by a lifetime of dedication, a lifetime of work well done. The sun was setting over the Navy base, casting a warm golden hue across the docks. The last of the USS Vanguard's crew had returned to shore, their mission a success. The sound of engines roaring to life was replaced by the quiet hum of conversation as sailors packed up their gear and prepared to head home. Yet, amidst the bustle of the evening, Elias Graham found himself standing at the edge of the base, looking out over the sea. It was hard for him to fully process everything that had happened. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had stepped away from the Navy, leaving behind a legacy marred by a single failure. Now, here he was, standing on the edge of a new chapter, one where the mistakes of the past had been erased and his place in history had been restored. The ceremony that Admiral Foster had promised was set to take place the following week. The Navy was going to formally recognize Elias for his contributions to the LM-2500 engine and the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. But as important as that was, what mattered most to Elias was that the people who had once doubted him had come to understand his value. It had never been about the accolades or the recognition, it had always been about proving to himself that he was still the man he had once been. And now, after all the years of struggle and pain, he could finally say that he was. As the wind carried the salty air toward him, Elias felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had spent so much of his life focused on perfection, fixing engines, solving problems, and trying to make everything right. But now, he understood something more important: redemption wasn't about fixing the past. It was about moving forward, embracing the lessons learned from mistakes, and finding peace with who you were. Elias had done that, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The impact on others. Back at the base, Captain Nathan Reed sat in his office, reflecting on the events that had transpired. He had seen firsthand how Elias had transformed from a forgotten man into a hero. At first, Reed had been skeptical, unsure if Elias's reputation could be salvaged. But the more time he spent with him, the more he realized how wrong he had been. Elias wasn't just a skilled engineer, he was a leader. And he had led them through one of the most difficult challenges they had faced. Reed thought back to the first time he had met Elias, when the old engineer had walked into the maintenance bay with nothing but a brass rod and an unwavering confidence. That moment had marked the turning point for the entire crew. Elias's presence had been a quiet force, but it had been enough to inspire the engineers, to get them back on track and solve the issue that had stumped them for hours. There had been no grand speeches, no fanfare, just a calm, calculated approach that fixed the problem and saved the mission. The crew had learned a valuable lesson from Elias: true leadership wasn't about having a title or authority. It was about using your experience, your expertise, and your heart to make a difference. Captain Reed made a note to himself to pass this lesson on to the younger generation. Elias Graham had shown them what it meant to lead by example, and that was a legacy that would continue to influence the Navy long after the mission had ended. As the crew prepared to leave for home, many of them sought out Elias to offer their thanks. The engineers who had once been skeptical of him now viewed him with respect. The men and women who had been part of the Vanguard's mission had learned that the path to success wasn't always a straight line. It was full of challenges, setbacks, and failures, but it was also full of second chances. Elias had reminded them all of that. One of the young engineers, a man named Ryan, approached Elias as he was finishing up his work in the hangar. "Mr. Graham," he said, his voice a mixture of admiration and awe. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you did. You saved us. You saved the mission." Elias looked up from the console he was working on, meeting the young engineer's gaze. "I didn't save anyone, Ryan. The crew did. We all worked together to get the job done." Ryan smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "I know," he said, "but it was your leadership that brought us back. Without you, we would have been stuck. You showed us what real engineering looks like. You didn't just fix the engine, you fixed our confidence." Elias's face softened, and he nodded. "That's what it's all about. Sometimes the hardest part is trusting in yourself, even when everything around you is falling apart. But once you do, everything else falls into place." As Ryan walked away, Elias felt a deep sense of pride. He had passed on his knowledge, his skills, and his wisdom to the next generation. He had come full circle. Not only had he redeemed himself, but he had also left a lasting impact on those who had once doubted him. That, to him, was the real measure of success. A new beginning. Elias spent his final days at the base preparing for his departure. The Navy had arranged for a small ceremony to honor him, but for Elias, the greatest recognition had already been given. He didn't need a plaque or a medal to know that he had done something meaningful. The look in the eyes of the engineers, the gratitude in the voices of the sailors, those were the things that mattered. As he packed his belongings and walked away from the hangar one last time, Elias felt a sense of closure that had eluded him for years. He was no longer the man who had been discarded by the Navy. He was no longer defined by his mistakes. He had found peace, not through external validation, but through the quiet assurance that he had done everything he could to make things right. The world outside the Navy was still there, waiting for him. But Elias knew that he had a new path to follow. He would continue to work, continue to share his knowledge, and continue to inspire others, just as he had inspired the crew of the USS Vanguard. As Elias boarded the train that would take him away from the Navy base, he looked out the window and watched the base fade into the distance. The sun had set completely now, but the stars were shining brightly above. The night was calm, the air crisp and clear. It was a new beginning, one that he was ready for. His journey wasn't over. It had just begun. And for the first time in years, Elias Graham felt truly free. In life, we often encounter moments where setbacks or failures seem insurmountable, and it feels like the world has turned its back on us. But the story of Elias Graham, a man who was once cast aside by the very institution he had served, teaches us that redemption is always within our reach, if we're willing to confront our past and rise above it. Elias faced the crushing weight of a single mistake that threatened to define the rest of his life. Yet, instead of letting it consume him, he chose to rebuild, not just his reputation, but his sense of purpose. The key message here is that failure is not the end, it is simply a lesson waiting to be learned. No matter how difficult or painful, the road to recovery requires patience, humility, and, most importantly, the courage to keep going. In our own lives, we all face moments of doubt, rejection, or regret. It might be a mistake at work, a personal loss, or a relationship that falls apart. But like Elias, we have the power to take responsibility, make things right, and emerge stronger from adversity. True growth doesn't come from perfection, it comes from resilience and the willingness to learn from our mistakes. Elias's journey shows us that what truly defines us is how we handle failure, how we rise from it, and how we continue to contribute with purpose, even when others may have turned away. There is always an opportunity for second chances, and often, our greatest strengths are forged in the fires of past challenges. As we go through our own struggles, we must remember that it's never too late to change, to learn, and to lead. It's never too late to prove to ourselves that our worth isn't defined by our mistakes, but by the actions we take to make things right. Whether it's at work, in relationships, or within ourselves, it's never about how many times we fall, it's about how many times we rise again. If this story resonates with you, and you believe in the power of resilience and second chances, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell to stay updated on more content that will inspire you to keep pushing forward, no matter what life throws your way. Let's keep learning, growing, and supporting each other.